In California, several counties and cities are suing the big oil companies to hold them liable for the damages that climate change is causing to the infrastructure out there. As judges consider these cases, one thing that they will be asked to keep in mind is big oil's history of deception and lies. A group of scientific experts filed this friend of the court brief out in the Ninth Circuit, carefully charting that history, that pattern of deception and lies. The group of scholars and scientists chronicled how the fossil fuel companies had actual knowledge of the risks of their products and had taken, and I quote here, proactive steps to conceal their knowledge and discredit climate science, end quote, while at the same time taking steps based on that science to protect their own assets from the impacts of climate change. It's a 51-page document, so let me cut to the chase. Big Oil knew for a very long time that the production and burning of fossil fuels would be disastrous for the planet, yet they did everything in their power to confuse the public, undermine the scientific evidence of the dangers, and prevent action to stave off this worldwide problem. The brief makes a fascinating read. Here are some highlights. Way back in 1959, when I was a kid and Dwight Eisenhower was president, Columbia University held a symposium attended by oil industry executives to mark the 100th anniversary of the petroleum industry. At that event, the legendary Dr. Edward Teller, the physicist, warned the industry about global warming. 1959. He said, a temperature rise corresponding to a 10% increase in carbon dioxide will be sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge New York. This chemical contamination, he said, the release of these emissions, this chemical contamination is more serious than most people tend to believe. 1959. A few years later, in 1965, at the American Petroleum Institute's annual meeting, API President Frank Eichard briefed the Big Oil Trade Group on a report from President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee that predicted significant global warming by the end of the century, caused by fossil fuels, and warned, quote, there is still time to save the world's peoples from the catastrophic consequence of pollution, but time is running out, end quote. American Petroleum Institute, 1965. API then commissioned a Stanford Research Institute report on the climate problem, which was made available to its membership in 1968. The report said, and I quote here, rising levels of CO2 would likely result in rising global temperatures. The result could be melting ice caps, rising sea levels, warming oceans, and serious environmental damage on a global scale, end quote. Then, in 1969, Stanford produced a supplemental report for the American Petroleum Institute. As the authors of this brief tell the Ninth Circuit, I quote, the report projected that atmospheric CO2 concentrations would reach 370 parts per million by 2000, exactly what it turned out to be, end quote. So that was 68 and 69, very clear warnings that have come to pass. And Big Oil did not just rely on the American Petroleum Institute to do its research on climate change. Ed Garvey was an Exxon scientist at the time. Mr. Garvey said, quote, by the late 1970s, global warming was no longer speculative. Did you get that? By the late 1970s, global warming was no longer speculative, said the Exxon scientist. The issue was not, were we going to have a problem? The issue was simply how soon and how fast and how bad was it going to be, not if. Indeed, Exxon did a lot of climate research, and they understood the science well. A 1979 internal Exxon study found the increase in CO2 concentration is due to fossil fuel combustion, and the present trend of fossil fuel consumption will cause dramatic environmental effects before the year 2050. Meanwhile, back to the American Petroleum Institute, they had put together a task force on what they called the CO2 problem. In 1980, Dr. John Lorman told this API task force that foreseeable temperature increases could have, quote, major economic consequences and globally catastrophic effects. American Petroleum Institute, 1980. Back to Exxon, Roger Cohen, the director of Exxon's Theoretical and Mathematical Sciences Laboratory, warned in 1981, the next year, about the magnitude of this problem. It is distinctly possible, he said, that Exxon's planning scenario will later produce effects which will indeed be catastrophic, paren, at least for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population. In 1982, Roger Cohen reiterated his warning. Over the past several years, a clear scientific consensus has emerged, he said. This is 1982. A clear scientific consensus has emerged regarding the expected climatic effects of increased atmospheric CO2. He continues, there is unanimous agreement, 1982 again, unanimous agreement in the scientific community that a temperature increase of this magnitude would bring about significant changes in the Earth's climate. Unanimous agreement in the scientific community. In 1982, Exxon's own scientist said this. But almost 4 decades later, the Trump administration pretends that we just don't know. Well, we do know. So back to the brief. In 1982, an internal Exxon corporate primer said that in order to mitigate the effects of global warming, there's a need for what they called major reductions in fossil fuel combustion. There are some potentially catastrophic events that must be considered, they said. Once the effects are measurable, they might not be reversible, end quote. So on into the late 70s and the early 80s, they knew. This is from a 1998 report by Shell Oil's Greenhouse Effect Working Group. I quote, man-made carbon dioxide released into and accumulated in the atmosphere is believed to warm the Earth through the so-called greenhouse effect. By the time the global warming becomes detectable, it could be too late to take effective countermeasures to reduce the effects or even to stabilize the situation. So, long story short, Mr. President, Big Oil knew, API knew, Exxon knew, Shell knew, they knew. But Big Oil also realized that understanding climate change meant limiting carbon emissions, and that meant less oil sales. So they began to tell something very different than what they knew to the public. A 1998 Exxon internal memo acknowledged that, and I'm quoting it here, the greenhouse effect may be one of the most significant environmental issues for the 1990s, end quote. Exxon's position would be to try to emphasize the uncertainty in scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect. And that became the drumbeat of the industry. Minimize the danger, the one they knew, that greenhouse effect may be one of the most significant environmental issues for the 1990s, but instead undermine the science. So the industry set up front groups with innocuous sounding names like the Global Climate Coalition or the Information Council on the Environment to do this PR work for it. The scientific brief notes this bit of industry propaganda from 1996 from the so-called Global Climate Coalition. If, they say, if there is an anthropogenic component to this observed warming, the GCC, this Global Climate Coalition, believes that it must be very small. Well, here's what an earlier draft of the same document said. The scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impacts of human emissions of greenhouse gases, such as CO2 on climate, is well established and cannot be denied. Is well established and cannot be denied. They just weren't telling the truth. They knew, and they said things that they knew were not true. Money poured from the oil industry into these denialist groups. In 1991, the so-called Information Council on the Environment launched a nationwide campaign with one goal: to reposition global warming as theory, not fact. This thing that they said was well established and cannot be denied, they decided to reposition as theory, not fact. The polluters kept this up all the way through the 90s. A 1998 American Petroleum Institute strategy memo tells what they wanted people to believe, even though they knew it wasn't true. They said, it is not known for sure whether A, climate change actually is occurring, or B, if it is, whether humans really have any influence on it. Again, well established, cannot be denied on the one hand, and not sure whether it's occurring or whether humans have anything to do with it on the other hand. Here's Martin Hoffert, who was an Exxon scientist for 20 years. He said, even though we meaning the Exxon scientists, even though we were writing all these papers saying that climate change from CO2 emissions was going to change the climate of the earth, the front office said otherwise. The front office, which was concerned with promoting the products of the company, was also supporting people that we call climate change deniers. So even as they spun this massive fraud out to the public, Big Oil internally took the evidence of climate change seriously. They took the evidence of climate change seriously enough to factor it into their own planning. So while they were telling the public that this wasn't for real and we don't have anything to do with it and the science isn't secure, they were doing their own planning based on that very science. For instance, in designing and building the Sable gas field project off the shores of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Mobil, Shell, and Imperial Oil explicitly told their own engineers about sea level rise, that, quote, an estimated rise due to global warming of 0.5 meters may be assumed. Big Oil protected its own assets against predicted sea level rise based on this science, while at the same time funding a massive campaign of deception to fool the public and policymakers about this science. They protected themselves and they connived to prevent the public from taking steps to protect itself. Mr. President, there are some unsung heroes in this climate battle. Among them number the dedicated and assiduous group of scholars and scientists who track this climate denial apparatus that the industry built. Many of them are the authors of this brief. Robert Bruhl, Justin Farrell, Benjamin Franta, Stefan Lewandowski, Naomi Oreskes, Jeffrey Supran, and they're just a few. There are many, many others who are watching and examining and reporting and subject to peer review chronicling the climate denial apparatus set up by the oil industry to fool the public. Patiently and thoroughly, they assembled in their brief a record of industry malfeasance, and they are helping to make sure that the long history of industry deception is part of the court's official record. I thank them for their work, and I yield the floor.